Hello, Social 20-1. This is Lesson 1. And at the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to define nationalism. So go ahead in your notes, write down the word nationalism. And in a moment, we will work on defining it. The second thing I'd like you to be able to do today, at the end of this lesson, is identify some different types of nations. Once again, we're going to be using our online resource and the embedded notes that we have within it. So looking at some different definitions of nationalism, we can look at a quote from Peter Singer. He says, "I believe that nationalism is a very strong force, but there are other forces operating. There are tendencies pushing towards a larger picture, especially in Europe, I think, but I still think nationalism is real." So Peter Singer is suggesting that nationalism is a real force, a very strong force, but it's not the only force. We'll have to come back and look at that later. We have another quote here that says, "I distinguish between nationalism and patriotism." So through the course of this course, we'll have to look at what that might mean. Albert Einstein, a very intelligent man, he weighed in with this quote, "Nationalism is an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind." So by the end of this course, we want to identify why Einstein would see it as infantile and as a disease. Charles de Gaulle, former leader of France, says patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism, when hate for people other than your own comes first. We might use the word ultra-nationalism to describe that by the end of the course. George Bernard Shaw says patriotism is your conviction that this country is superior to all others because you were born in it. We have another quote, "The love of one's country is a splendid thing, but why should love stop at the border?" Again, that might go back to Peter Singer's idea about other forces. We have a Diefenbaker quote, one from Pierre Trudeau there as well, both former prime ministers of Canada, by the way. "A single branch is weak, but a group is strong." It's another idea of unity that is essence of nationalism. So the first step that I'd like you to be able to do there is taking these different definitions of nationalism, combining them, and come up with what do we see as nationalism. Well, we could say that we've been told that it's a force, a very strong force, but not the only force. We've been told that it does have a negative side. Einstein sees it as a disease, an infantile disease. It's connected to the concept of patriotism, but it's not necessarily one and of the same thing. It is defined by borders, and it's about strength and unity. So that might be what we have on nationalism so far. The second major outcome of Lesson 1 today is types of nations. So we'd like you to be able to leave here today understanding that there are different types of nations that exist there. And when we look at the document, it talks about, in the beginning, cultural nations. So a cultural nation would be a nation that what binds them together is a shared culture. So what is culture? Shared culture can include things like cuisine and fine arts and way of life. So a cultural nation is one type of nation. We also see that sometimes we'll see nations attached to places on a map. So they might be geographic nations. So what the people share in common is a common occupation of a common relationship with the land, a common history with the land. Nations and nationalism might be built around common customs, common history, common morals and values, and ways we see the world as it should be, ways we see the world as it could be. And that might be an ideological nation. We have ethnic nationalism based upon our genetics, our ancestry. We have our civic nationalism based upon our relationship with government and our laws that define the way we relate to one another. With economic nationalism, we share a common class, a common economic lifestyle with others. Karl Marx talked about economic nationalism as he talked about the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. We might have political nationalism based upon a pride for one's democracy or a belief in one's government. So within this quick introduction, we've seen political nationalism, economic nationalism, civic nationalism, ethnic nationalism. We talked about cultural nationalism. You could add linguistic nationalism, nations based upon they speak a certain language. We talked about ideological nationalism, common views, the way we see the world we want to see, common assumptions about the role of man, the nature of man, those sorts of things. So that's at least 7 different types of nationalism. So the second outcome that we had today, the first one was what is nationalism. Second one is different types of nation, different types of nationalism. And we have at least 7 that we've identified. Now before we wrap up lesson 1, I want to point out that in these lessons, there's always going to be additional rabbit holes that you can go down for more information. Things in black are meant to be extra information. So there might be some quotes in black that we didn't talk about or we didn't spend as much time on, or there might be some hyperlinks that we could go and spend more time on. Or if at this point you can't quite define what cultural nationalism is, then there are some links here for you as well. This is what cultural nationalism is. It's a hyperlink that will give you some more examples, some more real world examples so that you can perhaps identify or see it better. There's some additional links here for more information about civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Again, only if these concepts escape you. If you can't understand what civic nationalism is, this idea of submitting to the same legal code, the same idea of law and order or rule of law. So there are some additional YouTube videos here. Again, only go to them if you're having troubles defining nationalism or understanding the different types of nationalism. Now at the end of this, we have some ideas of, here's some multiple choice questions that you could complete based upon the information. So what I'd ask you to do now is complete this quiz and email me the answers. So it can be an open notes quiz, so you can go back and look up certain concepts, certain ideas like what is civic nationalism, and it's a quick little test to see if you understand the concepts. And then after that there's another sample multiple choice quiz, but the second one, it has the answers snowflaked. So I'm not asking you to send me the answers to those ones, only email me the answers to those first. I believe there's 7 there. But I gave you some additional ones just so that you can see more multiple choice questions. What would questions about nationalism look like? Here's an excellent quote. That's why it's in green box like that. It's an essential thing. From Howard Zinn. You may remember him from the corporation video from Social 10. If not, that's okay. It's called The Scourge of Nationalism. And it's in a green box because that's the type of source you could see on an A1 this year. So you could always take a look at that too if you wanted to challenge yourself a little bit more in this lesson. Say, can I identify nationalism within a source? Is the ideological perspective here, is it challenging nationalism? Is it celebrating it? And what language embedded in the source announces that ideological perspective? That might be a good next task to do before you move on to assignment 2. Lastly, what would an A2 look like? Well, an A2 looked like last year was all about globalization, right? So this year it's all about nationalism. So we're going to identify something about nationalism. Here we say, by nature, mankind is violent and selfish. Therefore, in order to survive, we must unite with our nation. So this is celebrating nationalism. So the central theme that we'll see this year in essays is nationalism. This one's celebrating nationalism as a path to, through unity, a path to longevity, right? To survival. So there's some thoughts on lesson 1. So in the end, you can always go back and say, okay, did I get my outcomes? Do I know what nationalism means? Check. Do I understand that there's different types of nations? And how might I be tested on it? Well, that's why I gave you those sample essays so that you know how you might be tested on the types of nations. And then finally, looking at an A1, what might an A1 source look like? There's the Howard Zinn source. And then how is this working towards an essay? Well, in an essay this year, you're going to be tested on to what extent is nationalism a positive source, and that's the outcome, or that's the theme of that source right there. So that's it for lesson 1. Do email me your multiple choice results for those questions I'm asking about, and we can connect to see if you have any questions. Enjoy your day.